This is a list of the 50 smartest companies in the world compiled by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology this year. 9 Chinese firms are listed, and over half of them have presence in the city of Guangzhou.
Guangzhou is pushing the IAB strategy, which stands for IT, artificial intelligence, and the biopharmaceutical industries.
The highest listed Chinese firm, iFlyTech, is one of the world's top AI system developers. In 2015, the company set up its southern China headquarters in Guangzhou and has been working with the local government to enhance various services with AI.
With our technologies, 30% of Guangzhou's mobile carrier and bank services are processed by AI. In the medical field, our AI can detect 94.1% of tuberculosis cases.
AI doesn't function on its own. It's applied to existing industries. The company says Guangzhou, as a megacity, lays a good foundation for the application of AI.
Guangzhou has a long history of business and commerce, and therefore it has extensive industry data and input resources in the fields of education and healthcare.
Biopharmaceutical, according to the IAB strategy, is another important industry for Guangzhou. The city has one of China's largest pharmaceutical markets, and the industry grew by 17.8% last year.
Behind me is the Guangzhou International Bio Island. This 240 square meter industrial park is part of the local government's initiative to promote the biopharmaceutical industry in the city.
The city is building more industrial parks like this for the industry. GE Healthcare is partnering with Guangzhou to establish a 350,000 square meter biocampus to support large-scale manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals in China.
They are IAB vision, so if you look at information technology, AI, and also biotech is one of the three. I think from vision, long-term vision by the Guangzhou government align exactly what we wanted to accomplish for the biocampus ecosystem. So I think this whole business model, it's a perfect example of private-public partnership.
While biopharmaceutical is one of the fastest growing sectors globally, China only accounts for about 15% of the industry. Guangzhou's IAB strategy aims to join hands with the private sector to narrow that gap.
For more on this year's Fortune Global Forum, we are joining in our Beijing studio Liu Baocheng, who is the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics here in China. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in New York, we have Jeremy Kaplan, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Digital Trends. Welcome, Jeremy. And in London, we are joined by Joseph Mariathasan, who is a partner of Pangaea Finance Partners and also a contributing editor of Investments and Pensions Europe. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the three of you. Let me begin with you, Professor Liu. It has been quite a while. Fortune Global Forum in China has not attracted that much attention. This year, it seems there's quite a spotlight.
Yes. I think this is really a critical year where we're going to see a lot of transformation technology that are really delivering the commercial results. And also that the world is really having a very large split on the policies behind whether they're going to drive globalization or whether they want to roll back on the domestic policy. And also that businesses are looking for a major turnaround at the crossroad.
Right.
So this is really an important movement that we need to keep a close watch of what can be delivered at this forum.
So a forum like this, particularly after the 19th Party Congress was just concluded in China, could be a very important sign as to where things are. Mr. Kaplan, of course, you've been in the tech world. Will innovation really provide us with some of the solutions as a result of all of these dramatic changes around us?
Yeah, technology and innovation are buzzwords that every company likes to put behind themselves. Everyone likes to be associated with innovation. It's a great word. And increasingly here in the US, we've been seeing products coming across from China that are hugely important and innovative. We're talking about the forum over there. We have the CES forum here in the US, which increasingly has seen the presence of larger Chinese companies as well. So there's a very clear sense of all of these companies trying to embrace globalization. But then, as the professor said, we have this situation where government policies play a huge factor, and it's going to be very interesting over the next couple of months and years to see how those policies play out in terms of the actual products that reach consumers on shelves and what becomes of the technology and the innovations that created those products themselves.
A lot of economies need to update themselves through innovation and some of the other means. Mr. Mariathasan, do you think there is strong enough determination, though, including those Fortune 500 companies that are coming to the Fortune Global Forum here in China? Are they really determined to have really a revolution of what they've been doing so far?
I think the companies themselves are clearly trying to take advantage of innovation, of trying to take account of automation, the internet, robotics, and so on. I think the more interesting question is what the impact has been and is going to be on the societies they're living in, and in particular, the reaction we're seeing politically in terms of the changes in society arising from populist parties in Europe, the election of Donald Trump in the US, and so on. And I think that phenomenon is something that companies are increasingly becoming aware of themselves.
Decades ago, Professor Liu, the Fortune Global Forum first time came to China. It was a time in the middle of China's just opening up and reform. And everybody was amazed with all of these limousines and the global CEOs with their entourage and luxury hotels and everything. People were dazzled by that. But now, decades later, Chinese have seen enough material wealth. The question is whether China will be able to still, with enough courage, open up its door, while at the same time be able to do those very tough and painful reform within its own framework as well. So Professor Liu, what do you think is likely to happen after the 19th Party Congress? After all, China has already got quite a blueprint for itself.
Well, it's not only courage, but also confidence, and behind which is really the sophistication level of both policymakers and also the business leaders that are there. Is not only dealing with the Chinese domestic issues, because when China's door was first opened, we wanted to say, okay, how much of foreign multinationals can really we attract to deliver some of the technologies here in China and to create employment. But right now, the Chinese business leaders and policymakers are looking around the whole world for opportunities and also to identify challenges and devise strategies to address that. So it is still a very important event. And now it is really the companies that are really leading the technology, and they are fueling not only the finance but also commercialization process for all of them.
You know, Professor Liu, at the time when China just opened up, it's kind of easy in a way in terms of what you need to do. You just follow others. That's whatever worked, you adopt it and try to make sure it's going to work within your own framework. But now, China becomes the second largest economy in the world, very likely to be probably the largest in the world. Secondly, people look at you and talk about your model. Thirdly, you got a lot of things also within your country that an external pressure is not likely to be really solve the problem as it was decades ago when reform and opening up it was just introduced. So things could be a little bit more challenging. And it probably needs more guts from within China itself in order to solve this problem. Professor Liu, so what could be this next steps that we are talking about here, Professor Liu?
I think the good corporate governance is always there. It's not only the courage now, it's really the sophistication to follow the international rule and also to build transparency in the operation, and also to look at the whole world at the global map to identify challenges and opportunities. And of course, you know, to how the Chinese business leaders get really allied with the policymakers in terms of their political orientation. So that's also another very important point we need to pay attention to.
The same thing. I mean, Mr. Mariathasan, decades ago, China was a newcomer into the World Trade Organization, and China was learning, a good student, shall I say. And now, decades later, that system has been challenged by some of the biggest economic powers of the world. I mean, the international trading system, for example, WTO, globalization. So here's the thing, from a student to possibly you have to shoulder certain kinds of leadership role or certain kinds of responsibilities for carrying and innovating the system. This is going to be a very dramatic change in terms of role China is playing, Mr. Mariathasan. So that dramatic change, what would that mean for many here in China and also people like you elsewhere?
Well, I think the primary challenge for the world, particularly for the developed world, arises from two fundamental economic forces which no one can control. One is the rise of emerging markets, of which China is clearly the leader and the example, where the living standards in China and in India 400 years ago, the living standards in China and India were comparable to those of Europe. And within 10, 20 years' time, the same may well be true again. So you're getting a leveling out of the playing field, of the disparity between developed markets and emerging markets.
Yeah.
And that's been driven by a sucking out of middle-class jobs from developed world. And the second also is the rise of automation, of the internet and robotics, which again is destroying middle-class jobs in Europe and the US. And those two forces are unstoppable. And so that gives rise to a lot of problems in Europe and the US. It's given rise to populist parties. It's given rise to the election of Donald Trump.
But the
issue now for the...
But the question is, Mr.
I was about to say, the issue now
I
for
asked you
China,
earlier, that is, yeah, what kind of role China is likely to play in the years to come? Let me go to you, Mr. Kaplan, because earlier Mr. Mariathasan was also talking about it. Well, you know, technology is likely to be a threat to us, but we all know in any kinds of industrial revolution, technology is the thing that comes first, and then you have to change your system. Of course, some kinds of tragedy, wars happen, but we want to avoid that this time. So, Mr. Kaplan, when you have the dramatic changes of the powers and correlates with the dramatic changes of technologies, how are different factors like companies, societies, governments play their roles? What are some of the previous lessons and experience that we can learn today, Mr. Kaplan?
Well, it's very interesting to look at these two different markets. Here in the U.S., we look at the Chinese market as an emerging market, and I think a lot of the largest Chinese companies feel exactly the same way about the U.S., that there's a huge opportunity to be gained over here. So we have these two giant superpowers looking at each other saying, how can we work effectively? Is it competing, or is it working, or is it allowing opportunities for our largest companies to work in these different markets? So we have this interesting question of whether the government policies are going to be, or governments battling against each other even, are going to be a real challenge here. Does Donald Trump's policy prevent a U.S. company from investing in China? Or at the same time, does Donald Trump's policy prevent a Chinese company from taking out an investment in a U.S. company, which it's hoping to do, and which might fuel innovation in the U.S. and abroad? So I think what we're really looking to see out of this forum is, you know, what's the net, what's the takeaway? Do we have some decisive take on these policies that will guide investments and future opportunities?
That's right. Professor Liu, the same thing to you. I mean, earlier, multinational companies, you know, those on the Fortune 500, are supposed to be pillars, but also they are also controversial because people think there are so much interests involved between them and the politics. But on the other hand, now you see some of the companies that are really transforming borders. For example, some of the tech companies, they are even bigger than some of the middle-sized country, some say. And yet the traditional multilateral companies are becoming weaker because they're not anymore on the front line of innovation. So that is another transformation you are seeing in the landscape. It makes things ever trickier, and yet you could say there probably could be new opportunities for newcomers too, Professor Liu.
Yes, they, structured companies, they also have hurdles in bureaucracy, and they have built quite a level of comfort with what they have been doing and what they have succeeded. And that's the opportunity that provided for entrepreneurs and also for the application of new technology, new business model. And so that's why the world is still moving. It's no one that really dominate forever. So now, Walmart used to be a superpower, but now it's being challenged, to a very tough extent by the e-commerce of the Alibaba model. And now the Facebook is also challenging all the big communication devices. So this is how exciting the world is going to get to be.
Well, not only that, among the tech companies themselves, it could also be interesting. For example, Alibaba vis-a-vis Amazon. For example, Google vis-a-vis the so-called BAT here in China. The former is more around e-commerce. The latter is a competition, some say, and could be cooperation about AI, artificial intelligence. These are all dramatic changes in the landscape. How these companies are likely to interact with one another could be of great interest, Mr. Kaplan.
Yes, exactly. And here we see the exact challenge. With Google, it's been a real battle to get into the Chinese market at the same time that the Chinese government has been fueling companies that compete directly with Google. So as those companies have grown and become gigantic and look to enter into the U.S. market, is that a fair form of competition? One of the key things that our companies, that the U.S. companies have been looking at. If we can get back for a second to the cultural question, I think this is a very interesting one that we haven't delved into enough here. Looking at the culture in Silicon Valley, one of the things that's fueled the innovation we see over there is individuals that have had great ideas and the ability to share them and work collaboratively together with or without support from the government. You've got two guys with a great idea, sit down together at a bar, build a company, and boom, all of a sudden there's $1 billion valuation behind them.
Well, not every one of them
is
successful, but there are some that could be successful.
True.
By the way.
But so to what extent do we have that same environment being developed in China versus the government fueling it with a vast amount of money, which is another great way to create innovation. It's just a different model. It's interesting to look at.
So it is a debate about models, Professor Liu.
Absolutely. I think now, particularly for China, a couple of years ago, people built factories and found a foreign buyer and make stuff and sell it, and that was all. But right now, capital is playing a very important role to support efficiency and skill economy in China. And then the outbound investment is becoming so much a driver for China. It's not only there to absorb the technology, but really to get closer to the consumers and also to participate so closely in the entire value chain. So that's the change that China is experiencing in a very positive way.
Not to mention, Mr. Mariathasan, that there are emerging economies developing, the countries that are been developing in their own way, and that seems to be quite a success so far vis-a-vis what you have just been describing and analyzing about some of the European countries, for example, or some parts of the United States. Mr. Mariathasan, will these kinds of businesses exchanges be able to help us from outside the circle clarify some of the ideas that have worked and be able to jump on something that could be of potential for not just the business community, but also the society as a whole? And meanwhile, how to make sure institutional building so that the business community will not only serve their own purposes, but also the general good, particularly at a time of dramatic technological transformation. Mr. Mariathasan, I know it's a big question, but I think this is really worth discussing.
Absolutely. I think all companies ultimately need to see their role as having some societal benefit. Now, I was listening to Al Gore last week at a conference, and he was saying sustainability is the most exciting investment challenge humanity has ever seen. The ability to create companies that help society actually live in a world of limited resources, of issues to do with global warming, all sorts of things. Companies have to play a part in this, and to their credit, many companies are taking advantage of opportunities like green technology, global warming, how can you actually find ways to alleviate that? China's actually been very active, and it's very gratifying to see the lead China has been taking on some of the issues associated with global warming, for example, where there's been huge emphasis on electric cars, on green energy, and so on.
Very interesting.
So I think it is a fascinating area. It's an important area, and it's also possibly, many people argue, it is an existential issue for the future of mankind. How can the corporate world actually focus more on creating a better society as well as pure profits?
Exactly.
And that's a great thing to talk about when you talk about where the government is spurring the investment. Artificial intelligence is this buzzword that we talk about in technology all the time. Artificial intelligence is going to shape everything and rechange how we do everything. And it might make our lives a little bit better, but isn't necessarily fueling the better society that you were talking about just now, Joseph. To what extent does the government fuel investments in something like that, which is good for business, versus fueling investments in cleaner energy, in green cars, electric cars, that sort of thing? And here's where China has a real chance to shape the dialogue, I think.
I think everybody has a chance to shape a dialogue as long as the parties want to make their effort. We have to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for your contribution. Liu Baocheng, Joseph Kaplan, and Joseph Mariathasan. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us.